The Helix 9 orbital station hung in the void, like a crystalline monument to galactic cooperation, which was ironic, considering most of the species inside spent their time trying to prove they were smarter than everyone else. Today's gathering at the Intersystem Metallurgical Symposium was no exception. Approximately 400 sentient beings from 73 different worlds had crammed themselves into the grand exhibition hall, and the air filtration systems were working overtime to accommodate everything from methane breathers to the Qualix delegation that apparently exuded a scent resembling burnt cinnamon. Nobody was happy about the Qualix. The hall itself was a marvel of architectural showmanship, all sweeping curves and transparent aluminum walls that offered a panoramic view of the void beyond. Holographic displays floated at strategic intervals, showcasing various breakthroughs in materials science with a kind of unnecessary visual flair that suggested someone in the design department had recently discovered what special effects were and couldn't stop using them. The Galactic Materials Council had spared no expense, which meant they charged every attendee triple the normal conference fee and called it an investment in knowledge. At the center of the hall stood the main demonstration platform, currently occupied by Creve Thor of Thermalia Prime, a being who could only be described as what would happen if an octopus decided to become a bodybuilder and developed an ego to match. His 6 arms moved with practiced precision as he arranged his presentation materials, each limb ending in 3-fingered manipulators that were apparently the gold standard for fine motor control in this region of space. His chitinous hide gleamed a deep copper color under the station lighting, polished to a mirror sheen, because apparently showing up to a metallurgy conference without looking metallic yourself was considered gauche. Creve Thor had spent the last 240 years mastering the art of forging, which was actually impressive until you learned that Thermalians lived for 800 years, and this was basically the equivalent of a midlife crisis hobby. He'd traveled to 17 different systems, studied under 12 different masters, and had recently published a paper titled Molecular Restructuring in Multi-Phase Alloy Systems, a revolutionary approach that had exactly 3 citations, 2 of which were himself and one that was definitely his graduate student under duress. The audience settled into their various seating accommodations with the usual conference bustle. The Centauri professors occupied the left quadrant, their crystalline bodies refracting light in ways that were beautiful until you tried to watch the presentation past them. A cluster of Drachnoth engineers had claimed the elevated seats in the back, their reptilian bulk requiring reinforced platforms and probably an additional structural inspection after the event. Scattered throughout were representatives from dozens of other civilizations, all united in their conviction that their species understood materials science better than everyone else. And there, in the third row, sitting with the kind of casual posture that suggested she was attending a mildly interesting lecture rather than the premier metallurgical event of the cycle, was the human. She'd introduced herself during registration as Dr. Chen Wei, materials scientist from Earth, and most of the other attendees had performed the intellectual equivalent of a polite nod before forgetting she existed. Earth was one of those late-edition species to the galactic community, barely 3 generations into faster-than-light travel, still figuring out which end of a plasma conduit was safe to touch. They had enthusiasm, sure, but asking them to contribute to advanced materials science was like asking a toddler to perform surgery. Adorable, but ultimately inadvisable, Dr. Chen wore simple attire by galactic standards, no environmental suit or atmospheric bubble, just dark pants and a jacket over some kind of shirt with writing on it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style, and she'd been taking notes on an actual physical notebook, with an actual physical pen, which had caused the Centauri professor next to her to spend 15 minutes staring in anthropological fascination at such primitive technology. She'd ignored him with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned that explaining things to condescending academics was a waste of oxygen. Creve Thor cleared his respiratory orifice, producing a sound like a trumpet played underwater, and the hall's translation systems kicked in. Esteemed colleagues, his voice boomed through the auditorium, because he definitely set his microphone volume too high and was either unaware or enjoyed it. Today, I present to you the culmination of decades of research, experimentation, and theoretical application. Today, I show you what I have termed harmonic layered alloy, or, as I prefer to call it, the future of metalworking. The lights dimmed because apparently every presentation in the galaxy required dramatic lighting. A holographic display materialized above the platform, showing molecular diagrams that looked impressive to anyone who didn't actually understand metallurgy and confusing to anyone who did. Krevthor manipulated the display with 2 of his arms, while the other 4 began arranging physical samples on the demonstration table. For centuries, we have understood that the strength of metals lies in their molecular uniformity. Krevthor continued, warming to his subject the way academics do when they've practiced this speech in front of a mirror. We've perfected single-phase alloys, created nano-structured materials with unprecedented properties, mastered the quantum-level manipulation of atomic bonds. But we reached a ceiling, a limitation that seemed insurmountable, until now. He paused for effect. The pause stretched. Somewhere in the back, a Dracnoth engineer's stomach gurgled audibly. Krevthor pretended not to notice. "I have developed a technique," he said, his vocal tone dropping to what he probably thought was a mysterious whisper, but was actually just normal volume, of folding metal upon itself during the forging process, creating thousands of microscopic layers that interact harmoniously to produce a blade of unprecedented sharpness, flexibility, and durability. Observe. With a flourish that involved all 6 arms in a choreographed movement that he definitely practiced, Krevthor lifted a blade from the presentation table. It caught the light beautifully, revealing a subtle pattern of waves and swirls across its surface, light and dark bands that flowed like frozen water. The audience made appreciative sounds, the auditory equivalent of polite applause. Even the Qualics stopped smelling like burnt cinnamon for a moment, which was probably a sign of respect in their culture or possibly just a coincidence. "This blade," Krevthor announced, "contains over 10,000 distinct layers, each folded with mathematical precision. The process took me 6 months and required maintaining temperatures within 0.3 degrees of optimal throughout the entire forging sequence. The result is a material that surpasses anything we've previously achieved in hand-forged metallurgy. I call it harmonic steel, and it represents a breakthrough that will revolutionize how we approach traditional metalworking across the galaxy." A Centauri professor raised a crystalline appendage. "The energy requirements must be substantial." "Indeed," Krevthor agreed, somehow managing to sound both humble and smug simultaneously. "The forge I designed for this process draws approximately 12,000 kilowatt-hours per session. The temperature regulation alone requires a quantum-stabilized thermal management system. This is not a technique for the casual craftsperson." More appreciative murmuring. Several attendees were taking notes, probably already calculating whether their research budgets could accommodate attempting to replicate this achievement. The Dracnoth engineers in the back were conferring among themselves in low growls that the translation systems wisely decided not to interpret. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, had stopped taking notes. She was leaning back in her seat with her arms crossed, and her expression had transitioned from polite interest to something that looked suspiciously like suppressed amusement. The Centauri next to her noticed and tilted his crystalline head structure in what might have been curiosity, or might have been an attempt to get a better viewing angle of the presentation. Hard to tell with Centauri. Krevthor continued his demonstration, using various instruments to test the blade's properties. He bent it to show its flexibility, and it sprang back perfectly. He used it to slice through test materials, each cut clean and effortless. He even performed a dramatic gesture where he balanced the blade on one manipulator tip to demonstrate its perfect equilibrium, which was honestly a bit much, but the audience seemed impressed. "The implications are staggering," Krevthor said, building to his conclusion. "While we've focused on molecular engineering and nanofabrication, we've neglected the potential of macro-scale manipulation. This technique proves that there are still frontiers in traditional metalworking, still discoveries to be made in the ancient art of the forge. This is not merely a blade. This is a statement. This is proof that craftsmanship still has a place in our technologically advanced civilization." The applause that followed was enthusiastic, or at least as enthusiastic as a room full of academic scientists ever got, which meant it was polite and measured with only a few actual displays of emotion. Krevthor basked in it, all 6 arms spread in a gesture of humble acceptance that was anything but humble. Then Dr. Chen made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a scoff, but it was definitely audible. In the settling silence after the applause, it carried Krevthor's primary eyes focused on her with the predatory precision of an academic sensing criticism. "You find something amusing, colleague?" His tone suggested that colleague was a generous interpretation, and he was open to revising it to something less charitable. "Doctor." Chen straightened in her seat, and several attendees in the surrounding rows turned to observe what promised to be an entertaining exchange. Academic conferences were usually deadly boring, so any hint of drama was to be savored. "Not amusing, exactly, Doctor," Chen said, her voice clear and carrying the kind of accent that suggested standard galactic wasn't her first language, but she spoke it well enough to be understood. "More like familiar." "Familiar." Krevthor repeated the word, as if she'd just claimed to have invented oxygen. "You claim familiarity with a technique I developed through decades of research." "Well, not your technique specifically," Dr. Chen clarified, and there was definitely a hint of a smile now. "But the general concept of folding steel to create layered patterns. Yeah, that's pretty familiar. We call it pattern welding, or Damascus steel, depending on who you ask and how historically accurate they want to be about terminology." The silence that followed had weight to it. Several species translation systems made questioning sounds, trying to determine if they'd missed something in the interpretation. Krevthor's hide flushed a darker copper color, which anyone familiar with thermalian physiology would recognize as the equivalent of narrowed eyes. "Damascus steel," he said slowly, "is a myth. A legend from pre-industrial civilizations about a magical metal that could cut through anything. It has no basis in verified metallurgical science." "Right, okay, sure," Dr. Chen said, nodding in a way that suggested she was agreeing to disagree, which was the polite human way of saying you're completely wrong, "but I'm going to let you figure that out yourself. Except for the part where it's absolutely real and people have been making it for over 1,000 years. She reached into her jacket pocket, and several of the more paranoid species in the audience tensed, though what kind of weapon they thought a human could be concealing in a jacket at a metallurgy conference was unclear. What Dr. Chen pulled out was a folding knife, compact and unassuming, the kind of tool that looked like it had been carried and used regularly. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a Damascus steel blade. My uncle made it for me 3 years ago as a birthday present. He does blacksmithing on weekends. As a hobby." The audience leaned forward collectively, which created an interesting visual effect of several hundred beings all shifting at once. Dr. Chen flipped the knife open with practiced ease, and even from the platform, even under the hall's artificial lighting, the pattern on the blade was visible. Swirls and waves, light and dark steel flowing together in organic patterns that looked less like engineering and more like art. Krevthor's primary arms reached for the knife before he remembered himself. "May I examine that?" "Sure." Dr. Chen stood and made her way to the platform, the crowd parting to let her through with the same energy as spectators at a sporting event when something interesting was finally happening. She handed the knife to Krevthor handle first, which was apparently the universal gesture for "I come in peace," and also "this is sharp, so don't be an idiot." Krevthor took the knife with 2 manipulators, holding it up to examine in the light. His other 4 arms produced various instruments from somewhere within his person, which raised questions about thermalian anatomy that nobody really wanted answered. He studied the blade from multiple angles, used a jeweler's loupe to examine the pattern, even employed some kind of scanning device that beeped and displayed data that made his hide flush darker. "This is," he began, then stopped. Started again. "The layer count is probably somewhere between 300 and 500, Dr. Chen supplied helpfully. "Uncle's not super precise about counting. He just folds until it looks right." "Until it looks right," Krevthor repeated faintly, the way someone might repeat the news that gravity had been cancelled. "Yeah, It's more of an art thing than a science thing for him. I mean, there's science involved, obviously. Metallurgy is metallurgy, but he's not breaking out the electron microscope between folds or anything. He just knows what temperature the steel should be based on color, knows how many folds will give him the pattern he wants, knows how to quench it so it doesn't crack. Experience, you know? A Drachnoth engineer in the back row spoke up, his voice a rumbling bass that required the translation system to work overtime. What kind of forge does this uncle of yours operate? What are the energy requirements? The temperature regulation systems? Dr. Chen turned to address the broader audience, apparently comfortable with public speaking, despite being dramatically outnumbered by alien species who'd probably been to more conferences than her entire planet had years in space travel. He's got a coal forge in his backyard. Built it himself mostly, some masonry work, a hand crank blower he salvaged from a farm auction. Temperature regulation is visual. You watch the color of the steel. Orange is too hot. Cherry red is usually about right, depending on what you're doing. Nothing quantum stabilized or computer controlled. Just heat, hammer, and time. Coal? A Zentori professor said slowly. You mean combustible carbon-based fuel. Prehistoric energy sources. I mean, we do have electricity, Doctor. Chen said, a bit defensively. Uncle's forge just doesn't use it except for the lights. More traditional that way, he says. Plus coal gets hotter than propane, and there's something about the feel of working with a real fire that matters to him. It's a whole thing. Blacksmiths are weird about tradition. Krevthor was still examining the knife, and his manipulators were trembling slightly. The edge geometry is perfect. The balance is exceptional. The pattern is. This is not random. This is controlled chaos, intentional variation within structured parameters. And you say your uncle makes these as a hobby. Weekends, yeah. Well, and some evenings after work. He's a plumber during the week. A plumber. Krevthor's voice had gone completely flat. Your uncle is a plumber who does advanced metallurgical manipulation on his days off. I mean, when you say it like that it sounds weird, Dr. Chen admitted. But yeah, basically. There's a whole community of hobbyist blacksmiths on Earth. They have meetups, competitions, online forums where they share techniques. Some people make knives, some do decorative ironwork, some focus on historical reproduction. It's like, I don't know how to explain it. It's a thing people do, for fun. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually only occurred in vacuum or in libraries, and the Helix 9 station hall had working atmosphere. It was the silence of several hundred highly educated beings simultaneously reconsidering their assumptions about the universe. A junior researcher from Qualix, brave or foolish enough to speak, asked the question everyone was thinking. How long has your species been doing this technique? Damascus steel specifically. We're not entirely sure about the original formulation. That knowledge was lost for a while, but we've got archaeological evidence of pattern-welded blades going back at least 1,500 years. Probably older. And we've been forging steel in general for, what, 3,000 years? Something like that. I'm a materials scientist, not a historian. 3,000 years, Krevthor said, still in that flat tone. Your species has been folding steel for 3,000 years. Well, not continuously, Dr. Chen clarified. We had some dark ages where we lost knowledge and had to rediscover stuff. And the really old Damascus steel from the Middle East, the original crucible steel, we only recently figured out how they did that. Turns out it involved trace impurities in the original ore that created carbon nanotubes at the molecular level, which is wild, because they definitely didn't know about nanotechnology, but they figured out the process anyway through trial and error. Humans are weirdly persistent about hitting metal until it does what we want. A different Drachnoth engineer, possibly the first one's colleague, growled a question. You said this was made as a gift. What is the value of such an item? The cost to commission such work must be substantial. Dr. Chen considered. Uncle gave it to me free because family, but if you were buying from him, probably 300-400 credits. Depends on the size and complexity. There are bladesmiths on Earth who charge way more for fancy exhibition pieces, tens of thousands for museum-quality work. But for a good quality user knife like this, a few hundred is pretty standard. 400 credits. At least 7 different species shouted variations of this simultaneously, creating a cacophony that the translation systems gamely attempted to sort into coherent meaning. The Zentori professor next to Dr. Chen's seat actually cracked, a small fracture appearing in his crystalline structure from pure shock, which was apparently a thing that could happen. Krevthor looked down at his demonstration blade, the one he'd spent 6 months creating, the one that had required 12,000 kilowatt-hours of energy and a quantum-stabilized forge, the one that represented decades of accumulated knowledge and technique. Then he looked at the knife in his manipulators, made by a plumber in his backyard on weekends as a hobby, given as a casual birthday present. "How?" he said, and his voice was very quiet now. "How is this possible? How does a species barely into space travel possess metallurgical techniques that we," he gestured at the assembled galactic scientific community, "have only just discovered?" Dr. Chen reclaimed her knife, folding it closed and tucking it back into her pocket. "I think maybe you didn't discover it. You invented around it." "Explain." "Okay, so context. Humans didn't have anti-gravity until like 60 years ago. We didn't have fusion power. We didn't have molecular fabricators or nano-assemblers, or any of that cool stuff you all take for granted. What we had was rocks and fire and a really urgent need to make tools that could kill dinner or our neighbors before they killed us. So we got creative. We learned to work with limitations." She gestured at the hall, at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. "You all developed advanced technology relatively early in your development, right? Once you figured out the basics of physics, you jumped straight to the efficient solutions: energy shields instead of armor, molecular assembly instead of forging. Why spend months hammering metal when you can print a perfect blade in an hour?" "Because it's more efficient," a Zentori professor said, though he sounded uncertain now. "Right, exactly, it's more efficient. But here's the thing about efficiency: it makes you skip steps. You all went from basic metalworking to advanced manufacturing so fast that you never spent thousands of years in the middle figuring out every possible way to torture metal into doing cool stuff. Humans didn't have a choice. We were stuck at the hitting things with hammers stage for a really long time. So we got really, really good at it." Krevthor was nodding slowly, his earlier defensive posture shifting into something more contemplative. "We optimized for the destination without exploring the journey. And we took the scenic route because our car kept breaking down," Dr. Chen agreed. "Look, I'm not saying our way is better. Your quantum forge is amazing. The precision you're achieving is incredible. But you're treating it like you invented something new when actually you just took a really complicated path to something humans figured out by accident 1,000 years ago, while trying to make swords that wouldn't shatter when you hit Vikings with them." "Vikings?" someone asked. "Aggressive Scandinavian raiders." "Long story. Not important." A new voice entered the discussion, belonging to a Qualix administrator who'd apparently decided the burnt cinnamon smell was an acceptable social sacrifice. "What other techniques does your species possess from this extended primitive phase?" Dr. Chen laughed, and it was not a reassuring sound. "Oh man, where do I even start? We've got centuries of empirical knowledge about fermentation for making alcohol and preservatives. We've got traditional medicine that used plants in ways we're only now understanding biochemically. We've got architectural techniques that don't require computers but can produce buildings that last thousands of years. We've got musical instrument construction that achieves resonances we still can't fully model mathematically. And that's just off the top of my head. Your species discovered these things experimentally." The Qualix administrator's tone was approaching academic horror. "What? You think ancient humans sat down and calculated the molecular structure of steel before they started forging? No. Someone noticed that metal that got hot and cooled fast was harder. Someone else noticed that folding it made it stronger. Someone figured out that heating and cooling cycles could change its properties. They didn't know why it worked. They just knew that it did, so they kept doing it and refined the techniques over generations. A thought occurred to Krevthor, and his hide paled slightly. What else are humans doing as hobbies that we consider advanced science, Dr. Chen grinned, and it was the expression of someone about to ruin several people's entire worldview. Okay, so glass blowing. We've been doing that for like 4,000 years, making everything from simple bottles to complex optical lenses. There are hobbyists who can create glass structures at home that you'd probably need a laboratory to reproduce. Then there's pottery and ceramics. We've been playing with high-temperature material transformation since basically forever. Casting metals, same thing. We've got people who do lost wax casting in their garages to make jewelry and sculptures. She was warming to her topic now, and the audience was listening with the rapt attention usually reserved for hostage situations. Woodworking. We've figured out hundreds of ways to join wood without fasteners using just clever geometry. Stone masonry, same deal. We've got buildings made of precisely cut stone blocks that you can't fit a knife blade between, no mortar. Just rocks balanced so perfectly they've stood for thousands of years through earthquakes. Textile arts. We've been weaving complex patterns since before we had written language. We've got traditional techniques for dyeing fabrics using plant materials and minerals that produce colors chemistry said shouldn't be possible with those ingredients, except they totally are. Stop, the Zentori professor said weakly. Please stop. I'm just getting started. We've got fermentation techniques that can create thousands of distinct flavors of alcohol, cheese, bread, pickled vegetables. We've been doing genetic selection breeding on plants and animals for 10,000 years, which is basically genetic engineering without understanding genetics. We've got traditional medical techniques like bone setting and herbal medicine that work even though the practitioners had no idea about anatomy or biochemistry. We've got navigation techniques using stars and ocean currents that let people cross entire oceans in wooden boats. Krevthor held up a manipulator in surrender. We understand. Your species has an extensive empirical knowledge base derived from prolonged technological adolescence. I mean, I'd have phrased it more positively, but yeah, basically. Dr. Chen looked around at the assembled scientists, all of whom were having various species-specific versions of existential crises. Look, this isn't a competition. You all have amazing technology that we're barely beginning to understand. Molecular fabricators are incredible. Quantum computing is mind-blowing. Faster than light travel, obviously revolutionary. But maybe there's something to be said for the stuff we figured out the hard way. A long pause settled over the hall while several hundred highly intelligent beings processed the uncomfortable realization that the newest, most primitive species in the galactic community had casually been doing things they considered cutting-edge discoveries because humans were apparently too stubborn to realize they should have been impossible. Finally, Krevthor spoke, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect or might have been defeat or might have been both. Dr. Chen, would your uncle be interested in consulting work? I find myself suddenly eager to learn these techniques from a master. I can ask him, Dr. Chen said, pulling out her communication device. Fair warning though, he's going to think this is hilarious. He's going to tell everyone at the blacksmithing club that aliens asked him to teach them how to make knives. I'm never going to hear the end of this. She tapped out a message, while the galactic scientific community watched, then looked up with a smile. He says he'd be happy to show anyone interested his setup, but you'll have to come to Earth because he's not flying across the galaxy when he's got a plumbing job scheduled next Tuesday. Also, he wants to know if any of you have ever done any metalwork before because he's not great at teaching theory, mostly just demonstrates and expects people to learn by doing. Learn by doing, Krevthor repeated, and there was something almost wistful in his tone. When was the last time any of us learned anything by doing rather than by simulation? The question hung in the air unanswered, because most of the assembled scientists couldn't actually remember. The Draknoth engineers were muttering among themselves with what sounded like excitement. The Zentori professors were having a rapid discussion in their musical tonal language that the translators were interpreting as variations on unprecedented and research opportunity. The Qualix delegation had started smelling like fresh bread, which apparently meant they were intrigued. Dr. Chen pocketed her communication device and addressed Krevthor directly. For what it's worth, what you made is genuinely impressive. The precision, the consistency, the mathematical approach to something humans mostly eyeball. That's valuable too. Maybe there's a middle ground where we combine your analytical techniques with our empirical knowledge. Could be interesting. Could be revolutionary, Krevthor corrected. He looked down at his demonstration blade again, then at the pocket where Dr. Chen had tucked her knife. I spent 6 months creating what a plumber makes on weekends. I'm not certain whether to be humbled or offended. Be educated, Dr. Chen suggested. That's what conferences are for, right? Learning stuff you didn't know? I suppose that's technically the purpose, yes, though in practice most attendees come to present their own work and feel superior to others. Humans do that too, Dr. Chen assured him. Academic ego is apparently a universal constant. A junior researcher, emboldened by the informal turn the discussion had taken, asked a question that many were thinking. Dr. Chen, if your species has all this traditional knowledge, why did you bother coming to a galactic conference on metallurgy? What could we possibly teach you that you don't already know? Dr. Chen's expression turned serious, the humor dropping away to reveal genuine scientific passion. Are you kidding? You have alloys we've never dreamed of. You understand atomic bonding at levels we're just starting to explore. You can manipulate matter at the quantum level. Just because we figured some stuff out through trial and error doesn't mean we know everything. We know how to do things. You know why they work. Combine those? That's when real innovation happens. She gestured at the hall, at the technology surrounding them. This station we're on right now uses material science that would seem like magic to my ancestors. And it probably seems like magic to me too, because I don't fully understand the underlying physics. But I know that if we start comparing notes, if we share techniques and knowledge, we're all going to learn things that neither of us would have figured out alone. That's the whole point of this, isn't it? Collaboration? The Centauri professor, who'd been sitting next to her, spoke up, his crystalline voice chiming with what the translators interpreted as approval. A pragmatic and optimistic perspective. Perhaps we've been approaching galactic cooperation with insufficient humility. Or maybe everyone's just been too proud to admit they don't know everything, Dr. Chen said with a shrug. Humans definitely suffer from that too. We've got people on Earth who refuse to believe aliens exist, even though we've been part of the galactic community for 3 generations. Denial and stubbornness are apparently also universal constants. That got a ripple of what might have been laughter from species capable of the expression and various other sounds from those who weren't. The tension that had filled the hall was dissipating, replaced by something more energetic, more curious. Scientists were pulling out their devices, making notes, sending messages. The Drachnoth engineers were already plotting travel to Earth based on their excited rumbling. Several junior researchers were clustering around Dr. Chen with questions. Krevthor remained on the platform, still holding his demonstration blade, looking thoughtful. Finally, he addressed the hall with the authority of the scheduled presenter. I believe we should modify the remainder of this session. Rather than continue with my prepared material, I propose we open the floor for Dr. Chen to discuss human metallurgical traditions in more detail. Unless there are objections. The hall responded with a chorus of agreements in multiple languages and formats. No one objected. The day's carefully planned schedule was abandoned with the sort of spontaneous enthusiasm that academic conferences rarely inspired. Dr. Chen returned to the platform, looking slightly overwhelmed but game. Okay, so, full disclosure, I'm not a blacksmith myself. I can explain the science behind what my uncle does, but I can't actually do it. Different skill sets. But I can walk you through the general process, and I've got some videos on my device if anyone wants to see traditional forging in action. Videos would be excellent, Krevthor said, and he'd fully transition now from defensive presenter to engaged colleague. Perhaps start with the basic technique, and we can discuss the underlying metallurgical principles. What followed was one of the more unusual academic sessions in Helix 9's history. Dr. Chen projected videos of her uncle's workshop, of a coal forge being lit, of metal being heated until it glowed, of a hammer striking steel in rhythmic patterns that looked less like manufacturing and more like percussion. She explained carbon migration, grain structure, heat treatment cycles. She fielded questions ranging from the highly technical to the bewilderingly basic. A Qualix researcher wanted to know about quenching mediums and why oil versus water produced different results. A Drachnoth engineer asked about hammer technique and whether the force of impact affected molecular structure. The Centauri professors got into a lengthy discussion about pattern formation and whether there was a mathematical model for predicting the visual outcome of folded steel. Hours passed. The scheduled sessions for the rest of the day were quietly canceled as more attendees from other tracks heard about what was happening in the main hall and migrated over. The audience grew. Food vendors set up in the back, recognizing a captive audience when they saw one. Dr. Chen, probably experiencing the academic equivalent of being thrown into deep water, nonetheless handled the impromptu lecture with grace. She admitted when she didn't know things. She speculated when she could. She promised to put people in touch with actual practitioners who could answer questions beyond her expertise. At one point, someone asked about the economics of traditional blacksmithing on Earth, and Dr. Chen had to explain the concept of farmers' markets and craft fairs, where people sold handmade goods, not because they were cheaper than mass-produced items, but because they were unique, personal, artistic. This led to a 30-minute digression into human aesthetic values and why people would pay more for something made individually with care than something molecularly printed to perfect specifications. We like the imperfections, Dr. Chen tried to explain to an audience of species who'd spent millennia pursuing perfection. 2 knives from my uncle's workshop might be similar, but they won't be identical. Each one has its own pattern, its own character. And knowing that a person made it, that someone spent time and effort and skill creating this specific object, that matters to us. It makes it more valuable, not less. The Qualix researcher, who'd asked the original question, made a sound like wind through autumn leaves, which the translator interpreted as profound confusion. But with molecular fabrication, you can create exactly what you need, perfectly optimized for its purpose. Why would you want variation? Because perfect is boring? Dr. Chen suggested. Because we like knowing that things were made by someone? Because there's a connection between maker and object that matters beyond pure function. I don't know how to explain it better than that. We're weird about craftsmanship. Krevthor, who'd been listening intently, spoke up. Perhaps it's not so strange. I spent 6 months creating my blade, and while I pursued perfection, I also found satisfaction in the process. The meditation of repeated action, the gradual refinement, the intimate understanding of the material. These are not efficient, but they are meaningful. We may have optimized meaning out of our processes. That's kind of profound, Dr. Chen said. You should put that on a poster or something. By the time the session finally wound down, the station's rotation had carried them through a full day-night cycle. Attendees began reluctantly dispersing, though many stopped to exchange contact information with Dr. Chen, requesting introductions to Earth's blacksmithing community, or proposing research collaborations, or simply expressing gratitude for the perspective shift. Krevthor was among the last to leave the platform. He approached Dr. Chen with something resembling humility, his 6 arms held in a posture that apparently indicated respect in Thermalian body language. I owe you an apology. I approached this conference with arrogance, believing I had achieved something unprecedented. You've reminded me that knowledge exists in many forms, and expertise isn't limited to those with advanced technology. Hey, no worries, Dr. Chen said easily. You did achieve something unprecedented for your context. Just because humans got there first doesn't diminish what you did. Different paths, same destination, right? Perhaps, though I find myself eager now to explore your path, to understand these techniques not through theory but through practice. He paused, then asked almost shyly, your uncle's offer to demonstrate his craft, was that genuine? Would he truly be willing to teach? Oh, absolutely. He loves this stuff. Fair warning, he's going to make you help pump the bellows, and he'll criticize your hammer technique. He's gruff but not mean. Just old school. I believe I would benefit from old-school instruction, Krevthor said. When should I book transport to Earth?